G'day. Well, I felt there was a need for me to have a chat to you today about a story that came out of the Tasmanian newspapers last week on Dennis Ferguson by his advocate and lawyer Greg Barnes. This clip will and may trigger events from those who are surviving or have been victims of child abuse, and to you, I apologise if that happens, but I felt today more than ever it's time for someone to have the courage to show why we who have been victims of child abuse, no matter what we wear, we still have a right to be heard. You see, they say clothes maketh the man or the woman. Well, you know what I think? I went to work dressed like this every day for a lot of years. And you know what? Nobody understood what hid underneath the clothes. We can take the layers and layers of clothing most victims of child abuse who go on to become adult survivors. We tend to put more layers on, and they're like the invisible covers that never take away the scars or the remnants. But that does not mean we grow uneducated or without opinion or without the right to have our voices and our opinions heard and respected. So I hope that this doesn't cause too much pain or anguish for anybody. I hope you see my reasons and my rationale come the end of this clip. I'll leave you to be my judge. Okay, so this clip was my response to a piece that was in the Hobart Mercury last week in regard to Dennis Ferguson by Greg Barnes. What infuriated me more, and I think what really compelled me to sit and think about why I am so very tired of people like Mr. Barnes speaking out on behalf of the sex offenders and just adding more insult to the victims of child sex crimes. One of the passages that really angered me was this one. While some victims of child sex abuse have the ear of a compliant media, it needs to be remembered that when such people call for blood and hatred, they are not objective, they are biased because of their life experience. So their word is not gospel and generally not worth reporting. How dare you, Mr. Barnes, is what I say. But we'll get to the how dare you, Mr. Barnes, in a minute. First of all, let's work out who is Mr. Barnes and what makes him such an expert. And I guess we all know, no, I'm not going to go into what my opinion of an expert is. He is a lawyer, a barrister. He was a part of the Liberal Party, and then he was not. He was part of the Democrats, and then he was not. He was an advisor for premiers, and I believe both state and federal ministers. He is a writer, a columnist and an author. He succeeded Malcolm Turnbull in 2001 as the ARM chair. That is Greg Barnes. Greg Barnes has probably got a lot more to him, but this is what I've been able to research. He is of the belief that his opinion should supersede the opinions of people like me. He believes that the silks and the suits and the psychologists and the academics, they have a right to express their opinions because it's noted because of their educational standard. So let's talk about the article in question from Mr. Barnes that has subsequently been removed. So that kind of speaks a little in itself, doesn't it? However, Mr. Barnes says, it's time to look at why they offend and support them so there is no repeat. He says if someone had done this for Dennis Ferguson years ago, he wouldn't have gone on to become the whipping boy for the peddlers of hatred and fear. Mr. Barnes says individuals from within our community who go on to commit sex offences against children are treated as pariahs, and we demonise them and dehumanise them. Yes, because anyone that can brutalise or abuse a child, what label would you put on them, Mr. Barnes? That's kind of my question. Mr. Barnes goes on to say they are human beings with a soul. They are people who deserve their rights to be protected. How's about, Mr. Barnes, we start by protecting the victims of these Vile people. Mr. Barnes goes on to say, Dennis Ferguson, who died last week. I advocated for Mr. Ferguson, both within the media and as a lawyer. And after meeting Ferguson, I wondered why our politicians and child sex campaigners are dedicated, and child sex abuse campaigners who are dedicated to keeping children safe, were so outraged by this frail and beaten man that they passed a law to throw him out of his house. Yes, because there was an awful lot of children around. Now, Mr. Barnes, I've got one for you, because you say that we should be reaching out to sex offenders and making their lives a little easier so they don't re-offend. Dennis Ferguson did himself no favours. Putting yourself in a public swimming area surrounded by children, posing therefore, do you think that's any way, shape or form him wanting to be left alone so he can reform, as you put it? No, I don't. Mr. Barnes says that with the announcement of Ferguson's death, that CEO of Bravehearts, Hetty Johnson, was quoted as saying that, well, at least we go into 2013 with one less sex offender on the street. Well, I agree, and I think, quite honestly, they were the words that came out of the mouths of anyone who's ever been a victim of child abuse, who's ever known anyone who's been a victim of child abuse. So, while Mr. Barnes wanted to just single Hetty Johnson out, the fact of the matter is, every advocate, every charity that has anything to do with looking out for the betterment of those who have been abused, I say said the same thing. Strangely, Mr. Barnes disagrees. Mr. Barnes went on to say that the fanaticism of child sex campaigners is such that they cannot see that someone like Ferguson was just a human being, not a one-dimensional anatom who committed heinous crimes. Really? I must have missed that part. Excuse me. The one thing I really never really did understand about people who had to get dressed in suits to go to work, how uncomfortable their lives must have been. Anyway, getting back to Mr. Barnes. Mr. Barnes says that Johnson and others who campaigned for higher penalties for child sex offenders reminds him of the vehement and anti-communism times of the 50s, and those who seemingly saw their opponents as subhuman. Now you see, I believe, and this is me, Kazzie K, I believe if you can abuse a child, you are subhuman. Because children, with their innocence and their vulnerability, they are not, I repeat, they are not now, nor have they ever been, something that you can violate and then expect your human rights to be adhered to. Mr. Barnes says that he condemns the Gold Coast Bulletin and other media outlets who say people like Dennis Ferguson, who commit child sex offences, are evil and sick and vile. Mr. Barnes calls those tabloid favourites. I'd say they're pretty close to fact, Mr. Barnes. Mr. Barnes goes on to say that, sadly, it's groups that become alarmist in their campaigns. Why don't we turn our attentions to the serial child abuse meted out by the Gillard government and the coalition, of both of whom support placing children in jail-like conditions? Now, Mr. Barnes, you can take a swipe at the Gillard government and the opposition. And in certain instances, I would agree with you. Children don't belong behind barbed wire fences. Children belong where they're safe and protected, surrounded by love and hope. Yet, governments this country, since the beginning of this country, seemingly haven't put the human rights of children at the forefront, have they? Because if we did, we wouldn't still have those today struggling with forced adoptions, the forgotten Australians, the stolen generation. The list goes on, Mr. Barnes. When or where or why, can you explain to me, no one's afforded them their human rights? Mr. Barnes also says that where does all this hysterical demonising and dehumanising of child sex offenders get us? It certainly makes us a nasty society. Mr. Barnes says that it's the way we treat child sex offenders that sees them re-offend. Well, Mr. Barnes, can you not see there you go again, blaming the victims and those who campaign for victims? Mr. Barnes says that the courts would do better looking into the lack of support instead of the nasty, unintelligent rantings by individuals and groups who want sex offenders shunned from society, locked away for even longer periods, where in actual fact, we as a society would be doing our children a favour, states Mr. Barnes, if we advocated for better support for child sex offenders. No. How about, Mr. Barnes, we educate and we implement law reform? You see, I've been asking for years why it is that when we have criminal cases before our courts in relation to child sex offences, my question has always remained the same. Why do we not allow, before a judge discharges a jury, an adult survivor of abuse to deliver a victim's impact statement, so that when that jury goes to deliberate the fate of the sex offender, they know what this innocent child's life, who has now had it corrupted by the man or woman, the absolution should lie with the victim. Victims don't always speak up. For years, I know I didn't. And there's a reason. Because they've got to go through a police investigation. They've got to deal with the suits and the silks and the judges. And they get victimised all over again. And then they go to court, the jury deliberates, and even if the perpetrator is found guilty, seemingly, they get a slap on the wrist. Mr. Barnes says that's a good thing, because they'll learn if we just slap them on the wrist and send them back into society. I hazard a guess, Mr. Barnes, that you are wrong in this occasion. Now, that was pretty much the end of the article that Mr. Barnes had written and, as I said, subsequently removed. What I'm asking you to realise is this, Mr. Barnes. Whilst I can respect your educational accolades, perhaps you would be best advised to learn to respect the way in which you speak out for those who commit these crimes. You must understand we are victims from the moment of our abuse. We then go on to be victimised if we report it. And I, for one, will say this. I will not shed a tear for Dennis Ferguson. I will not shed a tear for anyone who can abuse and violate a child and then think that coming and saying, I'm okay now, I'm rehabilitated because the community is going to be nice to me. Think again, Mr. Barnes. And now, I think I've had my say on Mr. Barnes, and I'm going to now deliver the side that's going to be a little harder to see, but it's a lot more involved in truth. I just felt compelled before I go on to the next part of this to make mention of the Royal Commission into Child Abuse. Greg Barnes has come out having a go at Julia Gillard and the opposition for their take on children having to live behind barbed wire fences, of which I don't agree. However, governments from the beginning of time have known about child abuse in this country. It has taken Ms. Gillard to come out and say, enough is enough. Now, whilst I know from the moment Ms. Gillard announced this Royal Commission, I was thrilled over the moon just to hear the words from a sitting Prime Minister, because for the first time I felt that I and many, many like me had been recognised. Now, of course, after the euphoria of the announcement subsided, many were saying it was this or it was that, or it was based on an upcoming election year, or it was only going to be into the clergy. And you know what, we both, I guess we all, not we both, we all have to recognise it's a place to start. Anyone, anywhere that has an angst with the way Ms. Gillard has gone about this needs to just take a breath. It's a place to begin. And hopefully, with the commissioners Ms. Gillard has appointed, we will not only have an outcome for those who have suffered abuse from within the clergy or within organisations, we will have a focus point of how we can be sure this never happens again. I, for one, don't want to get on the bandwagon of, but Ms. Gillard's not allowing for people like me who had familiar abuse, as I like to call it. It will be a place for them to start. Let's let this Royal Commission do what it can. Let's support those that are doing the best they can. And let's hope at the end of it, we all see children henceforth never, ever have to live through what those who have been abused before them have. For me, I would just like to say this. I will give any support I can to anyone who stands up, puts their hand up and says, let's end child abuse. Now I'll leave you with that thought. Well, I've had my say on who and what and everything else I could find out about Mr. Barnes. Now, it's not that I'm angry, it's not that I'm put out, I just think that Mr. Barnes is ill-informed, and perhaps if he took the time to speak to survivors about their life and what their abusers took from them and their human rights and their civil liberties, perhaps then he would find there would be people more open to some of his beliefs. We'll keep it nice. For me, my abuse started at 9, and I remember that day with a clarity that never goes away. But what it teaches us when our abuse starts early is that we grow up under the lies and the manipulations and the violence that can come with child sexual abuse. Mr. Barnes would have us believe that these men and women who sexually abuse children should be cared for and their human rights should be adhered to. And I hear this from Silks over and over and over again. I hear judges hand down ridiculous sentences for those who can commit the most heinous of crimes. And it's of epidemic proportion. Now, you know, many people I mentor, many people that I speak with say, we can't beat this because there are pedophiles etched into the very fabric of society. And they would be right. Yet, does that mean we quit, we give up, we pack our bags, put on our suits and say, well, problem's too big, it can't be solved? Pretty much, that's what a lot of people do. And then there are those whose abuse has left them so broken, they hide away, they become reclusive. They live in fear. Mr. Barnes goes crook because he calls us the outspoken ones who create the problems for the pedophiles, instead of reaching out and helping them to learn how not to be pedophiles. I'm going to tell you this from me. I said that at the end of this clip I would show not only Mr. Barnes, but the world, the open and visual scars of a child abuse survivor. Mr. Barnes, what my abusers took from me was life. What they took from me was the ability to continue to give life. You see, Mr. Barnes, I can put on a suit and I can walk into a courtroom and I can hold my own. But when I come home, the very clothes that people accept me by only hide what I'm about to show you now. Please, I hope what I'm about to do doesn't create offence, but it's time that people like Mr. Barnes and those like him who believe that the pedophile, his rights or her rights should be equal to that of the victim. So please bear with me. We're going to try and do this as easily as we can for you. But here's where we go. My abuser used vicious forms. He would burn me with cigarettes. Those scars still live today. He would slice me and dice me. So I learned how not to make a noise. But I think the most vicious of all was this, the scar that is permanently etched across my stomach, that saw to it that at 13 years of age, when they tried to put my insides back together, that I would be okay, and I wasn't. At 26, that scar was reopened because the atrocities of my child abuse had seen the need for a full hysterectomy, removing any hope I might have ever had of bearing children. I was blessed, so blessed to have my daughter, and she was a miracle. But that was to be the only miracle, because from that abuse came years and years of torment, years and years of torture, years and years of fighting the worthlessness that people like Mr. Barnes make people like me and the many like me feel on a daily basis. So I guess, come with me while I sit down before I fall down. What I'm saying is, the scars we carry on our bodies are second only to the scars our mind carries every day. We don't go on to become vigilantes. We don't go on to become two-headed monsters. We're people asking. We're asking the powers that be. We're asking our politicians. We're asking our courts and our police. Help us who have been victims by seeing to it that those who perpetrate crimes against children are dealt with in a manner which sees the child victim or the surviving adult not be victimised or maligned any further. All I can do is ask you to think long and hard before you agree or disagree. But if you've been abused, don't ever, ever let anyone tell you that your opinion doesn't matter, because I'm here to tell you it does. So until next time, or I start crying, think about yourselves. If you've been abused, you matter. Your worth is insurmountable, and you are loved, and you have plenty to give and plenty to say, just like I do. So until next time, be good to yourselves and each other, and as always, say hi to your kids for me. Ta-da.